Good afternoon, and welcome to our panel discussion for the opening of Not About Bombs. And just to read a description of this panel discussion, today these 5 women aim to unpack the binary of ally, enemy, self, other, a universal wartime strategy. The conversation will explore the power of contemporary art by Iraqi women artists to both clarify and complicate the identity of the other, whether in or beyond conflict, and in an attempt to expand the discourse of identity and war beyond the constraints of popular media. So given that, I would like to introduce our panelists. And I'd like to start today with introducing our curator, Tricia Khutoretsky. And she is a visual arts curator based in Minneapolis. She has an MA in Arts and Cultural Management, and she draws from her childhood experience growing up in the Middle East to work with Iraqi and the Iraqi and American Reconciliation Project, curating exhibits that focus on American and Iraqi perspectives on the Iraq War. Not About Bombs follows a previous exhibit, Navigating the Aftermath, which debuted at the University of Minnesota Regis Center and continued on a statewide tour with a screening of the film, The Unreturned, which documented the stories of displaced Iraqis. She also recently conducted a series of interviews with artists, filmmakers, and writers for 10 years and counting, a project dedicated to raising awareness of the 10-year invasion of Afghanistan. Tricia currently works as the curator and director of Public Functionary, a new nonprofit exhibition space opening in Minneapolis later this spring. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Savneet Talwar. And Savneet is an associate professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her research examines feminist politics, critical theories of difference, social justice, and questions of resistance. Using an interdisciplinary approach, she is interested in community-based arts practices, cultural trauma, performance art, and public cultures as they relate to art therapy practice and pedagogy. She currently uses a portable studio to work in community settings to create critical dialogue regarding reproductive freedom, power, and social inequity as they relate to race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. Her current projects are Wandering Uterus Project, a do-it-yourself movement for reproductive justice, healing justice workshops for domestic violence lawyers in the Legal Assistance Department of Chicago, and creating an open studio for South Asian women at the Harmdard Center. Our third panelist is Jerica Arents. She is a peace activist and educator based in Chicago. She teaches at DePaul University and is on the staff of Pace Bene, an organization that offers education, tools, and training in integrated nonviolence and direct action. She recently spent a month in Afghanistan with Voices for Creative Nonviolence, learning about the effects of the occupation on ordinary Afghan people. Jerica is also a member of the Witness Against Torture and helped start the White Rose Catholic Worker, a house of hospitality and resistance. She is interested in radical critical education that promotes peacemaking and nonviolent change. I have to get something to drink. Oh! I too am a bit nervous.
Say less to you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Our next panelist. Jerica Sloane. Jerica joined the U.S. Air Force in 2002. Serving 6 years, Sloane deployed multiple times in support of the global war on terror. After the completion of her enlistment in 2008, she separated from the military to study art at the Ohio State University. Through her own difficulties reconciling her experiences and readjusting into civilian life, Sloane became concerned with the lack of support for returning veterans and her community's few generalized understandings surrounding service and our nation's wars. She became involved in OSU's newly developed Veterans Learning Community, in which veterans transformed their experiences into relevant research. In January 2010, Sloane received a grant through OSU's urban art space to co-curate with Ash, who's here, the Visualizing the Experiences of War exhibition, VIEW. VIEW aimed to broaden the narrative of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan by having original artworks expressing personal stories of war created through veteran and artist collaborations. She has conducted several art-making workshops in conjunction with the VIEW exhibition in an effort to further develop the dialogue between returning veterans and the civilian community in Columbus, Ohio. Sloane received her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree with an emphasis in sculpture in 2012. She previously curated here at the museum, Looked Over in 2012. Last but not least, certainly not least, I would like to introduce our moderator, Johanna Hans Budwalda. I asked to do this introduction rather than Hans introduce the panel because I've known her for many, many years, and I knew that as she described herself, she would be far too humble. In this room, she is loved by many, many people. She does work that is so under the radar, and she works exhaustively to support our veterans program. So I want to put that out there first of all. Johanna Hans Budwalda was born and raised in the Netherlands, and after roaming around the world and living in various countries, she settled in Chicago, and we're so lucky, in 1994. She has a master's degree in education in early childhood development and a master's degree in psychology. Hans has almost 20 years of experience as a therapist, administrator, and trainer working with survivors of war, including refugees, torture survivors, development workers, and veterans in the Netherlands, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and the US. She has written and presented extensively about her work. She currently has a private practice in Chicago and serves as Director of Mental Health at Vietnam Veterans Against the War Military and Veterans Counseling Program, as a coordinator for the Soldiers Project Chicago, and as a clinical volunteer for the Kovler Center for the Treatment of Survivors of Torture and the Civilian Medical Resource Network. Johanna feels strongly about issues pertaining to justice, equality, and peace. These values both guide her personal life and her work. She is a mother, she is an activist, she is a counselor, she is a therapist, she's a ceramicist, and she has her work up on Etsy. And some of her glazes are so luscious you just want to eat them. Anyway, given that...
As if you're into blue.
If you're into blue, yes. Anyway, before we go any further, I would like to, on behalf of the art committee here and the board and the staff of the National Veterans Art Museum, I would like to thank you all for being here today, bringing your experience, bringing your knowledges. And so before we even start, we're going to do something really radically different and give our panelists a hand of appreciation for being here today. Thank you. We hope to have time at the end for some Q&A, and we'll see how far we get with this discussion. If we don't, I have pencils and I have cards. We're interested in questions that you have that weren't answered, and Eric and I have promised each other that we will do our best to somehow answer those questions for you somehow, some way, someday. So given that, Hans, thank you so much, and we're proud to have you as our moderator today.
Thank you, Sue Ellen. So now I feel like we should all introduce Sue Ellen as well. So we'll do that another time, I guess. But Sue Ellen has set up a program called That Cat, a Veterans Creative Arts Therapy Program. I have heard many, many veterans come to me and said that it was amazing. It's an amazing experience for them. So thank you. So I've never moderated a panel before, so hang in there with me. But this panel today, we're going to discuss what does the Not About Bombs show mean to us, and how does the context of displaying this exhibit at a Veterans Art Museum change its meaning or its value. Like Sloane said, we're going to hopefully have some time in the end for question and answer. And we're particularly interested, of course, to hear from the veterans, since this is a Veterans Museum. And hopefully, at the end, we will all feel really inspired to ask ourselves, and maybe each other, the person next to you, your friends, how can an art exhibit like Not About Bombs contribute to a process of reconciliation after war and violence? This panel is being recorded by CAN TV, so that's why we're supposed to be speaking in this microphone all the time. So, but yeah, everything is being filmed, so if you have questions, I will repeat the questions so that they can film it in the end, okay? So Jerica, I'll put you on the spot, okay? So how and why is this show important for the National Veterans Art Museum and to bring it to the veterans community?
So I think to discuss that, we need to talk about the history of the museum. The National Veterans Art Museum's express mission statement is to, I don't want to get it wrong, inspire greater understanding of the real impact of war. And so in 1981, the museum opened. It was the National Vietnam Veterans Art Museum, and it displayed only works of Vietnam veterans. And in 2003, it decided to broaden the work that it displayed and include works from different generations of war. And in 2010, they dropped the Vietnam from the museum's name, so it's National Veterans Art Museum. And I think in order to continue to fulfill the mission statements, to inspire greater understanding of the real impact of war, we need to display art and discuss art and ideas concerning all participants of war. So that's why, having a show of 5 Iraqi artists is important, I think. Inclusively, you probably. I'm nervous, sorry.
So maybe Tricia, you can answer this question or begin answering this question. I'm wondering what the difficulties were in bringing this exhibit here, and if there were any concerns that the artists have. None of them are here today, so they can't speak for themselves. So I was wondering if you could share some about that.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah, it's just gonna get all the way up. Okay, well, we didn't initially plan for this exhibit to tour. We planned to show it in Minneapolis, and that was pretty much it. It was grant funded to be shown in Minneapolis. And we had an ongoing relationship with Aaron Hughes, who is on the board of the museum. And he was shown in one of our previous exhibits, so he found out about our exhibit and kind of started the dialogue of potentially bringing it here. I had the artists in Minneapolis for an artist panel and thought that there wouldn't be any problem when I approached them and said, this is really great, your work is going to be touring to Chicago. And actually they all wrote me back long emails about why it was problematic for them. And a lot of it had to do with misconceptions about the museum and about just being able, it's always problematic when you just go online and Google something and try and understand where someone's coming from just by the images that pop up. So their context for the museum was only what they could see online, the limited images of what was being shown. And so we had to kind of go back and forth between the artists and the art committee and the people involved to figure out if this was the right venue. So I guess it would just be that there was immediate kind of hesitation, but we also came to realize that that was going to be part of this process. I have an artist statement from one of the women who wanted me to read this just in response to this kind of question. And it's interesting because the women, besides 2 of them that are sisters, didn't know each other before the exhibit. They were brought together in Minneapolis for the artist talk and formed a very strong bond with each other, which was actually an amazing thing to facilitate through bringing their work together as a curator. And they were all open to Sundus's statement representing all of them. So, the US-led war and occupation of Iraq was represented in the mainstream media as one-dimensional in many ways. First and foremost, the Iraqi civilian face was invisible. Their voice was silenced. The only human stories that came out of the war belonged to soldiers and veterans, and rarely ever to the Iraqi civilian. The images that infiltrated the Western media showed Iraqis as either violent or oppressed, two stereotypical extremes that don't represent the richness, diversity, and resilience of the Iraqi people in the face of adversity. When Tricia approached me about the possibility of Not About Bombs being exhibited at the National Veterans Art Museum, it took a lot of careful and critical thought before agreeing to include my work. I had to consider potentially participating in normalizing the war and its devastating consequences by placing my work in what I thought to be a politically loaded venue. On the other hand, I had to consider that removing my work would further silence the Iraqi voice and add to the underrepresentation of the Iraqi perspective when discussing the war on US soil. By accepting to have my work shown at the National Veterans Art Museum in the US, I am giving my perspective as a young Iraqi woman who has always been critical of war and occupation of my native land, a space to exist where it has never been before. It is imperative that the work be given the context and presented carefully in order to not allow the perspective to be normalized, neutralized, dehumanized, or depoliticized. I hope that the exhibit will breed a life of its own and not only encourage positive dialogue, but some challenging and uncomfortable moments as well. After all, changing the existing discourse around the war and those affected by it is no easy task. I hope this exhibit encourages that change. So it's a little lengthy, but it's the gist of how they feel. Would you like to add anything to this, Jerica?
Sure. I guess the difficulties on our end, working with the museum and bringing Not About Bombs here, most of the National Veterans Art Museum community was on board with the trajectory that I had spoke of before, as far as broadening the perspectives and including views from many different war participants. But there was a small group that was concerned that it would be too political for this venue. I thought it was interesting that you said politically loaded venue, referring here, where we were concerned with bringing the show that it would be too political for our comfort. Yeah. All right.
Thank you. So this is not necessarily a photographic exhibit, but all of the work, almost all of the work in here are photographs. So I know that, and I'm not really, a lot of us know maybe that these artists also use other media usually, but they just chose photographs this time. And so given that both art and war are very intimidating topics for a lot of lay people, does the dominant medium of photography in this exhibit play a role in making the themes more accessible to the more general public? Do you want to say this? Answer that, Tricia?
So when I curated the exhibit, I didn't plan for it to be a photographic exhibit. I actually set out, it was following Navigating the Aftermath, which was veteran and Iraqi voices on the war. And I remember standing in that gallery and looking around and thinking, there's something missing from this dialogue. I realized it was that there wasn't, even though there were women artists, there was a female voice, a more feminine perspective that was completely missing from the dialogue on war. And at the time, there had been a lot of media attention to the women in the Arab Spring and the actual awareness that women are major victims of war, and their voice and their stories should be included when we're studying and thinking about the effects of war. And so I searched for contemporary works by Iraqi women because I thought about trying to show work that was potentially more modern and forward-thinking as well in the way that contemporary art can be, so that it would be a bit more unexpected. And in searching out female contemporary Iraqi artists, there's not that many that are just accessible through internet research and contacting other contacts. And I pulled the work together, and this is what I ended up with, was mainly photographic work. So I kept searching for paintings and other things, and then realized that I was forcing something, where that was in itself revealing, that photographs were the medium that these women in this context are choosing to communicate. And maybe there is something there about it being more real. I'm not sure, but it kind of has to speak for itself in that that's what organically came together.
Sure. So, I think concerning accessibility, photography is certainly a fine art. No one's contesting that, but everyone takes snapshots of their family or friends, and a lot of people that don't consider themselves artists dabble in photography as a hobby. So I think in that respect, photography can be a little more comfortable for a layperson to view versus maybe traditional works as painting or sculpture that have that artist as genius mythology attached to it. And concerning war photography, I think most of us understand war or know war through text and through images, through the mass media. So I think by the artist using an already established format for discussing war, I think it's smart and interesting.
Thank you. So, as we heard already, there's been quite a bit of discussion about what it means to have this exhibit here. And one of the things that art does in general is it wakes us up. It makes us have to think and get out of our comfort zone. It may ask us to change our point of view or opinion about things. So I was wondering if each of you could maybe share a thought or two about how to best navigate this place between seeing the art and having to think about what it means and how to change and what that discomfort zone is like and how to navigate that. And maybe you can even give a tip or two on how to navigate that.
Okay, I will start. I get to spend some time with college students, and I teach a class on activism, and so we talk about comfort zones, and we talk about being sensitive to what we're really feeling on the inside, and knowing that we spend most of our lives sort of in a realm of comfort. And as we move toward discomfort, we're sort of learning and growing in that tension. Outside of that sort of concentric circle is a zone of sort of paralyzing fear, which I talk about a lot if I take my students out into the street and have them do an action in the street and shut it down and get arrested. They're probably going to be in their paralyzing zone. But being aware of where we're at inside of ourselves and knowing that discomfort allows growth and allows a sort of freedom. Even though we might feel uncomfortable, we can be sensitive to those feelings and learn a little bit and grow a little bit. So the tip that comes to mind is when we're in that space of greater awareness, we can sort of identify what we're feeling and reflect on that and know that that's a space that we're in. And sometimes it's just an openness that we need to feel, right? We just need to be open to the fact that we can be changed by that, which is outside of ourselves.
So, I don't know if I'm going to answer this question in the way you have, but I'm going to just take off on this idea of, comfort zones. And I think the whole idea about identity discourses is about wanting to create comfort zones, and yet at the same time, they're not comfort zones. So I think that's what I'm touched by in this exhibit, is this idea that so much of categories of difference, like when we talk about people in terms of their categories as their racial background, their class background, their gender, their sexuality, those are ways to categorize people so that we can have this recognition and stay within that comfort zone. And I think when we begin to see outside of those categories is what makes us get into these discomfort zones. So I think for me, the whole idea of using photography, for me in this exhibit, is really about the performative nature of gender, especially given they're all women. And photography is a really wonderful medium, as you said earlier on, because of the kinds of photographs that have already been portrayed about war and what we see about war and how we've sort of objectified, war zones. I mean, it doesn't affect us on an everyday level, but when we begin to see what effect it's had in Iraq, that's been our medium of knowing. So I really like the way that these artists really use the camera to sort of turn the gaze on other aspects of how these war zones have affected individuals, especially gender relationships in here, So this very fact that they use the same documentary value as a way to create a discomfort for us, or even within the culture for that matter. I mean, I think that piece up there, if I can remember, the young girls who are graduating versus the widows who are standing there for their paycheck. What a wonderful juxtaposition of, what's happening to young women versus what's happening to women that have been already marginalized in society. So this idea of discomfort and comfort for me goes in, art is such a valuable commodity to really bring that out. And I think they use photography in a very nice way to do that.
I think that those are the idea of comfort and discomfort is prevalent everywhere in this exhibit, and it goes back and forth, and sometimes you don't want to go back to this is a female perspective, but it's also not surprising that as women, that's kind of what they're drawn to. And almost everything here comments on that, even from as you mentioned, the graduation photos, which is the future, to the million widows that are currently the mothers and aunts and grandmothers of these graduates that they potentially will have to support if they even can. The work in that corner by Sendis, the orchestra series was a body of work that she worked on during the war, where she would take media images constantly. She was obsessing over the media images coming out of her country, and she would reimagine them into paintings that took away guns and put in musical instruments. And it was her way of processing what was going on with war and what was going on with her country. And she talks about that experience as exhausting her, making that body of work, orchestra, kind of wore her down, but it was also her way of getting out all of the feelings that she had about what was going on with her family and friends back in her country. After that body of work, she started to create the Flight series, which was finding comfort and healing with these images that were uplifting and had to do with uprising over your situation and the future generations that have a lot of potential ahead of them despite the discomfort that they've been dealing with. So in almost all of the works, there's some sort of comfort, discomfort. Even with Julie's works, she's trying to make you comfortable with the Western-looking French model, blonde woman, but yet there's these uncomfortable stereotypes that she's being put into. So yeah, it's there in almost all of that work.
So a tip to handle discomfort, right? I hate discomfort, and I find that my discomfort tends to stem from ignorance. So I tend to try to learn as much as I can about whatever that's making me uncomfortable. So that would be my tip, to research, learn as much as possible. That's how I handle it.
So I was just, the only thing that came to my mind real quick was how that space of discomfort makes something interested if we're not, like, it's sort of about being moved. If I was looking at these pictures and it didn't do anything for me, it would just be boring. But the moment that I'm like, what's she trying to do? What does this all mean? It becomes interesting. So I think that's another thing about art. It almost has to put you in some kind of place where you are being moved for it to be interesting and for you to be wanting to come and look at it again and again and again. So the next question is about displacement and uprootedness. And I think, Jerica, if we have been assigned this question. They are shared experiences by people living in war zones, including artists and veterans, that these artists and veterans who have difficulty with reintegration or integration into American culture. This shared experience can have profound effects upon somebody's identity. And so I'm wondering if you, Jerica, maybe you can start. I don't know.
You start.
I start. Oh, I have to speak from. You have the same list of questions, don't you?
I do.
I can't cheat. So they want me to speak from personal experiences with my work of veterans. But I thought I'd speak from personal experience first because I lived and worked in a war zone for a number of years. And it was hard. It was really hard to adjust, learning the language, eating the food, negotiating how to take the bus, negotiating, going to the market and hassle, what do you call it, over the cost of the tomatoes and the rice and all of that. Learning how to live without a refrigerator, learning around not having a telephone. I would go to the telephone company building once a month to make a call. That was my, everything else was by snail mail. Learning to not feel safe, learning to, a lot of stuff like that. And it was hard, but, it worked. Coming back though, and I'm not from here, I went back to where I grew up, which was the Netherlands, was way harder. Emotionally was way harder. And I think that has to do with who I had become. And I think this is very similar to what a lot of veterans experience that I work with, is this sense of that the world here stayed still. Nothing happened. People are the same. But I am no longer that person that left, but I'm expected to be that person that left by the people who stayed behind. My friends think I'm still this way. My family still thinks that I'm this way from before I left, but I am not. And how do I fit in? How do I negotiate this world that didn't change, but I changed? But in that way, it seems like the world changed. I don't know if that makes sense. But it's harder to learn how to buy postal stamps in a country where you don't speak the language and stuff like that, you think. But it's actually way harder for me now to go back home and want to try to buy postage stamps, because I think I know what I'm supposed to be doing and how it's going to work, but it's not working like that anymore. So that's another thing about who am I? Do I still fit here? So this is a huge question that I've seen. And I think that is also a huge difference between refugees. I worked with refugees for a long time here in Chicago, and also for a long time with veterans. The refugees have a really hard time. They don't speak English, they don't know the culture, they don't, their profession suddenly that they had back home suddenly is now no longer relevant. I'm just thinking about, the Cambodians that were great rice farmers, but when they came to Chicago, what were they supposed to be doing here? Their skills had no relevance. And it was really, really difficult to adjust. What the veterans do though is readjust, which is at least as difficult as far as I can tell. So that's what I wanted to say about it. Does that work?
Of course.
Alright.
You gotta read this sentence right here.
Okay. So Jerica, I wonder if there is a commonality of experience between veterans reflected in the work of these women artists. If so, how is the commonality conveyed?
Yes. So Julie's work right here, you mentioned earlier. I think this could easily have made by a veteran with a few elements changed, the clothing, of course, but dealing with identity and transition, coming back, losing your uniform or your battle rattle. That's a lot of service members' identity is built into what they've done, like their position. So when they're coming home, they no longer understand their role or their purpose. I didn't. So I could see that. And here, this one behind us, I don't want to get it wrong. What is it?
It's Still Chaos.
Still Chaos. Dina and Selma? Yeah, okay. Trauma, right? And dealing with trauma and coming
Of
with
survival, basically.
right. And there's two kind of two characters, two actions going on, resisting and kind of hopelessness. And I feel like myself as a veteran, that's what I've struggled with, like understanding that there's something wrong, but fighting it, denying it, and then surrendering to hopelessness. I think that as well could have easily, been made by a veteran artist. Yes. There you go.
I just wanted to add to the trauma part because I think trauma has a huge impact on somebody's identity. And, the kind of war trauma that I have or that refugees have is very different from the kind of war trauma that veterans have. And it took me a long time to really understand that. Well, actually not that long. It was sort of like this, it hit me like, wow, this is what the difference is. You can't just, you can't treat it, I'm a psychotherapist, you can't treat it the same, you can't approach it the same. And I think part of the big deal there is that both groups are survivors of trauma, survivors of violence, survivors of war, and have lost their bodies, have witnessed things that they should never have witnessed, have lost their children. But veterans also went to a country with a gun, and most of our refugees did not carry a gun. And I know sometimes a refugee slips through that was maybe carrying a gun, but part of the reason why people are allowed to stay is when they are purely survivors, but they weren't aggressors, so they weren't carrying a gun. It's one of the major criteria for resettlement. And so I've met a lot of refugees who carried guilt, but it was often guilt around not having been able to protect their children or their parents. Like the refugees who lost their children in the middle of the chaos and have never been able to find them back, don't know if they're alive, don't know anything about them. But that guilt has been different and been qualitatively different from the guilt that a lot of veterans carry about things that they did, that they, now that they're back in the civilian world, are struggling with. Was that the right thing to do? Was that the good thing to do? Was that the morally right thing to do? And if people would know now what I did back there, my family would know, my friends would know, would they still love me the same? Or would they judge me for this? I'm judging myself enough. I don't want other people to judge me too. So it's a different kind of issue. And it really, really impacts people's identity and veterans' identity in that they, and not all of them, I have to say not all of them, many of them who have post-traumatic stress and who are struggling with this, they struggle with, am I still inherently a good person? And it's not just because of things they did, also things that they didn't do and that they felt they should have done now. And of course, none of that mattered when they were in the actual situation because they were following order, they were doing what they're supposed to do. They shot this person, otherwise they would have been shot themselves. So it was completely understandable and rational and the thing to do back there. But once you become a civilian again, things get a different meaning because there's a different value system governing our life in the civilian world. So that's one of the things that I've noticed that was so different between working with refugees, myself, the kind of trauma I have from living in a war zone and the kind of trauma that veterans deal with. That was a very long answer.
It was excellent.
Okay, there we go. So for the next question, I'm going to quote some of the written material from this exhibit, okay? So bear with me, I'm going to read this. This is an art that speaks an unconventional language, an art that speaks to the cutting-edge nature of contemporary art. Shared here is a platform for a generation of female artists who are undeniably influenced by the aesthetics of conflict and the stereotypes that define them, but not in the least limited by them. To bring the voices of the artists in the room today, when asked about identity, origins, and what defines them, the artist answered the following. So Sundus Abdul Hadi, she said, identity is as deep as our roots and as wide as our reach. And Tamara Abdul Hadi said, I think our identities depend on our origins along with where we've been and where we will go. And Julie Adnan says, I think identity is so individual that it's hard to say. I would actually argue that origins are not as important as where you go in life. So in that way, escape is possible. And Sama Al-Shaibi and Dina Al-Adib said, our identities are a construction of our collective and individual histories, encounters and memories across time and space. So I would like to call on our panelists here to share their point of view and expand this discussion of identity. Maybe Dr. Talwar, can you expand on intersectionality? It's almost impossible to say. So I would suggest you come up with another word there, but no. As it relates to identity and human experience and cultural memory. And can you offer a personal story to illustrate your point? And then when you're finished answering my question, I'm going to ask the other people on the panel to share their ideas about this.
Okay. So, we've been talking a lot about identity and a lot about violence so much of what we're speaking about, we use the word identity, but we don't break it down into what this really means. And so intersectionality is a theoretical framework. It's like, I would say, a toolkit in a way that essentially originated from experiences with women of color, scholars of color, who felt that the discourses within the feminist movement did not really represent who they were. And so intersectionality is a way of thinking, and it's a way of critical thinking about looking at people and their social positions. So intersectionality really looks at categories of difference, and those would be race, class, gender, sexuality, religion, ability, disability, etc. But what intersectionality suggests is that we're not defined by just one aspect of our lives. So if we look at this exhibit, we're not going to say, oh, this is about women, or women in, say, who are basically talking about loss and suffering and displacement. I think that when we look at this, a single marker of difference is not what defines us. What defines us is the multiple markers of difference. And that while as a woman, we may all have the same, on the basis of gender, there might be commonalities, but there are also ethnic differences here that we're looking at. And how ethnicity is defined within the same culture in various different ways. And then also the other thing I think they're talking a lot about is the notion of nationality, because all of these artists are either going back and forth, but their primary home is now either the United States or Canada or whatever. So intersectionality is really looking at, let's say, a road intersection, that when I'm standing in the middle, I'm not necessarily only defined by where I am, but it's defined by all the different intersections in which I'm located. So that's where we go back to saying that when we look at only one marker of difference, and we're fixing people in place, but intersectionality is something that is talking about multiple axes of difference. And so an example of that would be when we look at that particular piece, I'm forgetting, is that Julie? No, that's not Julie, that's Tamar. While she's looking at two different things, one is what happens to the widowed women and what their intersectional access might be versus the young girls who are actually graduating from school. So the other thing I also want to bring up is that, intersectionality is always proposing that life is not just something that's, linear, and they speak about the complexity of these intersections. So keeping in mind that all of our lived experiences sometimes are shaped by the social and the political forces, the cultural forces. So I'm going to go back to thinking a little bit about third world women. So we're really talking about these spaces that really are looked upon as third world. And when we're looking at that, we're also looking at the kinds of images that popular culture have that we become so sensitized to. So the idea of how stereotypes begin to develop, right? So the text and the visual images that we continuously see, as one of the artists actually wrote in there, she was saying that more too often our spaces are considered that we're violent people, we're oppressed women. So intersectionality is also asking us to complicate that, saying that we begin to look at people and begin to look at people in people's lives, especially take the context of third world women, that might come across as poor, uneducated, ignorant, submissive, overly religious, homebound, sexually constrained, victimized. So these are the kinds of words that have been used to define people and people's experiences, and that's where the stereotypes come in. So the idea is about complicating those stereotypes. So when we look at this work, I think one really has to look at it in a transnational context and really think about, how information has been distributed and consumed by us, in the West about people who at this point are in a war zone or where there's been tremendous violence and as a result of which there's been marginalization. I know I can go on, but I would like to let somebody else speak about it.
I think that this concept of intersectionality is really appropriate, definitely, for this show. For me personally, I always struggled with defining myself as one thing because I've grown up in Middle Eastern countries as an Asian American. My husband is now a Russian Jew, and I was influenced by Muslim culture, but my father's family is Catholic and my mother's family is Buddhist. So I've had a lot of influences, and I think I naturally look at contemporary art and the way that I curate art as an intersection of identities always. And when I brought this group of women together, it was in an attempt to just categorize an underrepresented group and then reveal the differences. Just to point out that they are contemporary Iraqi female artists, but that's it. Beyond that, there's going to be a lot more that you can find, and more is revealed in the difference between them than in the similarity that's just labeled. When I met them and spent time with them in Minneapolis, it was amazing that they related to each other so well and bonded immediately because they are a small group. But they are their own personalities and they've had their own experiences. When they left Iraq, how much family they have there, where they live now. There's Canadian Iraqis, there's American Iraqis in there. They're very different women. So I think it's always important to look at the differences instead of just similarities.
Yeah. I just want to add a really quick note about this notion of cultural memory, and usually what we mean by cultural memory is this is the kind of memory that is shared within certain ethnic groups or subcultures that is not necessarily part of historical dialogue, is part of, or historical text for that matter. So this is where the oral histories come in, and I think that's what I love about these images here, are that they tell a story, but they tell a story that may not necessarily be the story that we see in contemporary culture. These are stories that are very personal, that inform people. These are stories that have traveled within their own context, especially in the case of the two sisters working together talking about loss and displacement. That may not necessarily be things that we talk about in culture. So for me, cultural memory is not necessarily about historical text, but it's something that permeates the vicinities of, personal stories and lives.
So, maybe Jerica? Can you expand on this idea of intersection in
intersectionality. Oh, Jerica, can you expand on this idea of intersectionality and identity as it relates to nonviolent activism in your work here in the U.S. and in war zones?
I feel a little uncomfortable up here because I don't usually get to be in a space of such incredible artists and creative people, so I'm really thankful to be here. But I do, a lot of my work up until this point in my life has been around illuminating the perspectives of ordinary people in war zones, ordinary Iraqis and ordinary Afghans. Specifically, I spent a lot of time understanding the occupation of Afghanistan. I don't know if there are AVAW folks here or not. So my perspective is from the perspective of ordinary Afghans, but I feel like this incredible artwork and photography really illuminates that perspective. I think that's what we're talking about with intersectionality. I was able to spend about a month in Afghanistan in 2010, and it was a really incredible experience, and I hope I can just share a short story that may relate to our conversation here. I work with an organization called Voices for Creative Nonviolence, which was started in the early 1990s, mid-1990s, when a group of activists in Chicago decided that they wanted to raise awareness about the UN and US sanctions that were put on Iraq in the 90s. So before the invasion, Iraq and the Iraqi people went through over a decade of the most comprehensive sanctions that have ever been seen by a country. And no one was hearing about it in the United States. No one was talking about it. Now, conservative estimates say that about 1 million children died under the age of 5 because of the sanctions that were put on Iraq in the 1990s. So a group of activists here in Chicago got together and they decided to break the sanctions, an act of civil disobedience and civil resistance, and go over to Iraq. And they ended up sending over 75 delegations of people there to see what was happening on the ground, understand what sort of response the ordinary Iraqis had to the sanctions, and bring back stories, right? Bring back stories of what it's like to be a person there under the sanctions. So Voices shifted its focus to Afghanistan. I was able to go there, and I was asked to go there with a few other people, and we had traveled for a long time. I don't know how long it takes to get directly there, but we were traveling for over 36 hours, and we finally made it to Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, and we got on a helicopter flight to get to this province called Bamiyan, which is just outside of Kabul. And we were really excited to be there, obviously totally exhausted. Helicopter flight left us all feeling really sick and nauseous. My friend Kathy got sick right next to me on the helicopter, which was nice. But we finally touched down, and what was sort of there to meet us was a group of young men and women from Bamiyan, Hazara people, who had these incredible smiles and waved and smiled and greeted us off the helicopter and grabbed our bags and ran down the mountain. And we were greeted with such hospitality and such warmth. We made it to the hotel that we were staying at. And I was ready to just fall asleep completely. I don't know if there's anyone in the room who's traveled for long periods of time. But the young men and women in this group wanted to take us out for a meal for dinner, which is, of course, very hospitable. So we agreed, and Bamiyan province, which some folks might know in the room, very, very economically depleted part of the country. They have no electrical grid at all. All the energy that's sort of created is generated by generators, which are incredibly dirty. And most of the young people in Afghanistan only have a few hours of light at night. So we were sort of wandering through this province in the dark, and finally got to the place where we were eating, and we walked up the stairs and got into this room
And these young people, 11, 12, 13, 14, all the way up to 20, sort of filed in, and we couldn't speak any of the language, the Dari that they spoke. But we sort of waved and smiled and said hello. And my eyes fell on this young man who was sitting right across from me. And he was about 11 at the time, these huge, brown, gorgeous eyes and this smile. It was just incredible. And he raised his hand and motioned to the translator that we had there and asked a question in Dari. I remember thinking that his question rolled out really quickly and uncomfortably a little bit, and everyone in the room sort of just fell silent. And the translator turned to us, all of us Americans, all of us white Americans, and said, this young man is asking, do you think we're animals? Do you think that we are animals? That was the first question that I was asked when I went to Afghanistan. And it's a reflection of this question of identity, certainly, of intersectionality, certainly, but ultimately it's a question of humanity. This young man has grown up in a country that has been so annihilated, so destroyed by so many other countries, the United States included, but also the NATO forces, and also before that a civil war, and before that an invasion by Russia. And I think our hope, and the hope of nonviolence, and the hope of activism, and the hope of understanding radical inclusivity is saying that this young man deserves a voice at the table. His voice hasn't been heard. We don't ever hear it here. And I wonder if these young women, whose artwork we see around us, feel similarly, that their voices deserve to be heard as much as the voices of the powerful, as much as the voices of the people with money, as much as the voices of the people with influence. We have to open ourselves and hear what the voices of ordinary people have to say about occupation, and about war, and of displacement, and of invasion, and what does it look like to grow up as a young person in that culture. That's what I have to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that Kathy Kelly, your friend? So I'm asked here to talk about my work as somebody who was not born in this country and has worked with veterans who have identified themselves in many different ways. But I actually wanted to respond to something that Trish was saying. You said about the women who made the art in this show, they bonded immediately because they were a small group. And I'm wondering if there was more to it. And I'm saying that because whenever I'm in a room with a bunch of veterans, even if they've never met before, there is this kinship. They recognize one another. They don't have to say very much to understand each other. And as a civilian, you're never going to be part of this group. And I think it has a lot to do with their shared experience and their shared experience in the military, but also their shared experience becoming what we expect them to become a civilian, I guess. I don't think that's the right word, but so I wonder if there's more to it, and that it's part of identity of having a shared experience, like the women in this room did, who have been going back and forth, who maybe their parents speak Arabic at home and still maintain some of the Iraqi culture that they came from and things like that. So I wonder if there was just this kinship that they recognized each other and that they didn't need any words or many words to actually feel that they belong together. So veterans who have identified themselves in many different ways. I think that's a really interesting question because a lot of veterans I find that a lot of veterans who are stuck in the trauma and are not moving on maintain this identity as veterans. And there's a story about this one veteran who was in the military for a very long time, 25 years, had several deployments, etc. But he always referred to himself as a veteran. He always talked about everything he did when he was as a veteran. And then one time I asked him, so what about your identity as an artist? He was an artist. He was also great at decorating homes. So what about your identity as a decorator? What about are you that person too? And he could not, for the life of it, put those together. He said, he looked at me like shocked, and he said, I have never, ever thought of myself as an artist. And this man had art in museums and art exhibits and things like that, but he had never thought about himself that way. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that when there are new identities or identities beyond being a veteran start to appear, start to become possible, and that there's more than one story about who I am, it becomes a multi-storied life with many different things. I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm a mother, I'm a sister, I'm an artist, I'm a postal worker, I'm a student, there's so many different things. And once they start owning those identities as part of who they are, it becomes part of their healing, part of their moving on. And I'm not saying that if you are a veteran, you're ever going to not be a veteran, but it's one of many things that you could be. And so that's one of the things that I thought about when I thought about identity. The other thing that I thought about when I thought about identity was my own, in that I had never worked with a veteran for, the first 20 years. In fact, people in military uniforms were my enemy. They were the people I had nightmares about. They were the people that had hurt my families. And when I say my families, I'm talking about my clients, my refugee clients, or when I was working in war zones, the people that I worked with in the war zones. And when I first met veterans, and I was like, oh, I looked at them, and it was actually at a memorial buried with you, I think, by the river. It was Memorial Day or Veterans Day or one of those. And I looked at those young vets and I was like, oh, they look exactly the same as my refugees. They have the same look in their eyes. It's exactly the same. So then I had to struggle with myself for how is it possible that I can love them as much as I can love my refugee clients. And when I say love, I don't mean romantic love, but really truly care about their well-being. So I had to do a lot of talking with veterans and finding out that in the end they were very, very similar to me, and very, very similar to my refugee clients. And the moment that I could see that, there was no more problem for me. There was no more feeling like I can't do this, or why can't I do this, or sort of how is it possible? I couldn't wrap my head around it, basically, that I could work with people that were wearing the uniform, even though I had nightmares about people who were wearing the uniform. So, and once I did that, my own healing started too. So there's all these different pieces, I think, to changing your identity by getting to know each other and hearing each other's stories. And that's why I love this little exhibit, because there's so much more similarity and at the same time such a bunch of differences. But once you start wrapping your head around it, it will change who you are. And I think I've become richer for it, is that the word to say? A better person for it. So our last question, how does this exhibit help us as people who live in the United States to suspend the binary of oppressor and oppressed and open space for dialogue about reconciliation within ourselves and the citizens of Iraq, who are the other for most people who live in the US? How does this work affect the general conversation about the other? Or how does it demolish our general conversations, or maybe even demolish our misconceptions? And any of you can answer this. Eric.
No. That's okay.
That's a huge question.
I know, it's a very big question. So maybe we can say something minor.
Oh boy, yeah. So, I was talking about this this notion of binaries earlier on, that the very fact that when we're invested in talking about people as the other, that in itself is about creating these binaries, self and other, the other person, the oppressed. As I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking the work that is in this room again. I come back to the work in this room again. Is a space for us to begin to rethink what is really the goal of these artists. And I don't know what their goal is, but as a viewer, what I really take away from them in these photographs is that it's not, they can't change their identity. That's one thing I feel like. It's not that they can change their identity. I think their identity in some sense is very fixed. What they're trying to do is they're really trying to challenge the viewers in our own biases of when we look at an image, what really comes up in our mind. So I think for me, photography in that sense is a space where it's always about, the performative nature of identity is what they're documenting. And when you look at it, I really look at how they're creating spaces of resistance. I mean, for me, that in itself is the space where we begin to rethink about our relationship, with the oppressor and the oppressed, or self and other. And so they're using very specific strategies of reframing themselves, or about self-staging, about re-objectifying themselves. I mean, that in particular, wearing the hijab and sort of photographing individuals is about really turning the camera and the lens on themselves to really have an engagement with the viewer and say, what do you think? So I think for me, there in itself is a really powerful moment of creating different kinds of stories. I don't know about reconciliation. I'm not sure if I can say that. The only thing I can say is that I would go back to something like bell hooks. I'm not commenting on the reconciliation piece. What I'd like to say is that one of the things that bell hooks has always said, and that I find particularly drawn to, is that she says that, telling your story is just not enough. Right? That is just not, on one hand, we can tell our stories, we can talk about the pain, but the real difference happens is when we have a critical engagement with the politics of this world. And I think for me, this is a real political statement by these women, that they're asking us to engage in them. They're saying, can you recognize how when you see somebody as the other, what that really means for them? So I think for me, art is about really the conversation between the viewer and the object. So,
I guess I just want to say thank you to the National Veterans Art Museum for having this work here. It wasn't an easy process, dialoguing between the artists and the art committee of the museum, myself and Jerica, but we're here right now, and the show is up in this space, and the artists are all really excited and sent me emails before this weekend saying, we're happy that it's there, we're excited that our voices are included. I thought Sundus's statement was pretty positive, so I think that something's been accomplished between self and other just by this work being here, and so I think it kind of speaks for itself in that.
That's what I would say. I think just dropping stuff, just having the work up here is a gesture in good faith that we, although it was difficult, work together to make it happen, right? A common goal. So there you go.
Oh, sorry. Just quickly. Just one thing I haven't heard yet is I think with this question of us, them, or creating binaries, I think of Gandhi and his famous quote. He says, "God is truth, and truth is God, but I am not God, so I only have a piece of the truth." And I think radical peacemaking and nonviolence and nonviolent resistance is about understanding that the other has a piece of the truth. And I think ultimately connecting to an understanding of humanity that the other has a piece of us, that we can see ourselves in the other. That deconstructs this binary radically, and it makes us understand more deeply who we are and how we are in fact interconnected and not a set of us-thems or either-ors. We are all sort of parts of each other. And so I think there's something to say about seeing our experience and our lived experience in some of the artwork around us and what that means to understand and deconstruct the other.
So we've come to the end of our questions, our panel, but I also realized that we started late and now it's like after 5 o'clock. So my suggestion, if that's okay with you, that we take 1 or 2 questions, and if you have additional questions, please write them down for us so that we can answer them via email. So put your email address on the question. I think Sue Ellen is going to pass around some cards. So maybe 1 or 2 shorter questions if possible. That was easy. Nobody has one. Emily.
Now, I don't know the history of a lot of the female artists, the Iraqi female artists showing here, but their work kind of speaks to having a lot of art theory and a lot of access. I'm kind of just interested in which artist displaying here perhaps has the least amount of access, and that's really meaningful to me. I'm an art graduate and I'm an Iraq veteran myself. And so I think the perspective of people without all of the psychoanalytic theory and cultural theory and feminist theory and all these other things, the things that they produce is itself something to look and juxtapose to what we see. So can you, speak to perhaps the artist that has the least training?
Can you try and repeat it?
Yeah, I was going to have Tricia do that.
I think she was just asking about the training, academic training of the artists and how that changes. Actually, I think most of these artists have been fortunate to be educated and they've grown up away from Iraq. Julie is actually still there. She's Kurdish and she was enrolled in university art school there, so she as well has had training. I think they all have. And so I guess that's the difference is that their work is more conceptual, more academic. There are layers there. I also started working with IARP, bringing artwork from Najaf, Iraq to the US. We had kind of a cultural exchange and we were showing those works. Not all of those artists were art educated, and so you could tell that the work was more landscapes and abstracts and traditional paintings. So I think that the graduating seniors, that's important because one of the things that a lot of these women are commenting on, this piece and then that piece back there, is about the cultural production that's been destroyed and their history and art and music and all of that has been kind of wiped out, and it's really important for them to rebuild that. So that's also why these women and their work is super important to be shown, preserved, and talked about, because it's a record of an educated voice that's able to communicate on a particular level. So I hope that answered it.
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Okay, so one more, Michael?
Yeah, I have a question. First of all, thank you all for being here today and sharing your experience with us. My question is, how do we take this moment of dialogue and open this up to transformative action? How do we take these conversations and turn them into a social movement? After we leave here today, how do we go about making this something a part of our lives, part of our communities, part of our culture?
Sure, I think the question is around action.
I mean, I might be putting this into your question, but action not only inside of ourselves in reflection, but also outward justice-oriented action and social movement building. I mean, part of my work and part of my understanding of social movements and the peace movement in particular is that it's about bringing that which we don't see into the light, into our sort of cultural consciousness, into our collective understanding of what is happening in the world. And I think awareness is the first step of movement building, education, awareness raising, events like this, particularly what does it look like to be a person who's involved in, say, the occupation of a country, or what does it mean to be a person in this room, related to identity politics, related to privilege, and what can we do as people who are in this room, and I think the peace movement in general is lacking right now a lot of that critical voice and creative action. So when I think of this room being filled with folks who are creative and visual and really have a lot of energy in that, I think of direct action specifically. I think of what can we do to create actions, maybe connected to art and resistance that will confront the society and the culture that we live in, to really sort of investigate and see what's happening. Iraq and Afghanistan are countries that have been destroyed and decimated. Certainly there are people there who are incredibly creative and alive, and there are births and deaths and weddings and rituals and family that happen, but when we think of the effects of PTSD and the effects of trauma, how can we bring the stories into the light? How can we be people who are engaged in action and in truth-making and in meaning-making that creates a different future? Not only for the folks in the countries that we're talking about, but also for us as citizens of the United States. I don't know if that's an answer, but that's what comes to mind. Anyone else want to address?
I just want to say, for me, it's when people come together collectively, when people begin to think critically, it's really about, for me, it's about resistance. It's about people having to stop for a moment and really think. Yeah, I mean, I think Jerica, you gave a fabulous answer. I mean, it really is about, it's how do we mobilize ourselves and the information we have, but it all comes back to our own personal stories. I mean, I think today is a really great day for people to come together collectively and be interested in this. So this is a starting of a movement, or maybe the movement's already started, but this is another step on that movement. So.
Okay, well, thank you so very much for listening to us and being here with us and coming and seeing this exhibit. I also want to thank our panel members here. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us and with your beautiful insights about this exhibit and about a lot of stuff that's related to an exhibit like this. So have a wonderful evening, everybody, and I hope you tell everybody, all your friends and family, to come and see this exhibit as well. I think it's really important, and maybe that's a little bit of direct action right there. So thank you very much, and have a good night.